I don't care if we don't make money. Nobody else will.
Yeah.
That's it. It's a zero-sum game. If we don't succeed, nobody's going to succeed. We will burn the whole thing to the ground, Like we will make it so good and so cheap that nobody will have the opportunity to exist.
Yeah. Welcome to Spotlight On, where we examine the technology shaping our world through conversations with the people building it.
I'm Dan Levine, partner at Excel, and I'm thrilled today to welcome my friend David Cramer, creator of Sentry. David, thanks so much for joining us. We've known each other for over a decade now. It's got to be. Yeah. When did you join Dropbox? That's when we would have met.
2013, 2013. I don't know. I think 2012. I left at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015.
Yeah, it was the same timeline. So we've known each other for a long time. Yep. Before we get all of that, though, we're here to talk about Sentry. Sentry is the first investment I made at Excel in June of 2015, and then would continue to invest a bunch of times thereafter. But the company had, I think at the time, somewhere between 2 and 5 people. I think like Armin might have been a consultant at the time, but not full-time.
I think there were people transitioning out of their jobs.
Exactly. It was like right as that was happening.
Folks, basically.
Okay, so how many people work at Sentry today?
It's somewhere between 350 and 400.
Okay, so hundreds of people, despite you not being a big company person. I think you're doing an excellent job. But hundreds of people. I think you guys announced a certain ARR milestone. I think you crossed $100 million.
Yeah, we announced $100 million.
Which is unbelievable a few months back. And how many organizations, you mentioned almost everyone uses Sentry. What does that mean?
It's so many that it's like hard to keep up. Like I used to pay attention to the number every single day of the week. And now, because the number's so large, I check it like once a quarter, best case. It's at least 60,000 paid. Yeah. It's at least 100,000 total. Organizations. It could be hobbyists, but it's like logos if you think about it that way. So.
Totally, which is unbelievable. So it's one of the most popular open source projects in the world, and it's been incredibly successful as a company. So maybe give us a little bit about your background that led up to what became Sentry. Like talk about how you got first into software, open source, where you were working, and the first project and project name that would become Sentry.
Okay, we'll do the bridged version to keep it interesting. So teenager, worked normal teenage job from the Midwest, worked at Burger King.
It's got to be a restaurant.
Got to be a restaurant. Got to be a fast food restaurant.
Fast food restaurant. It was like Sonic, Red Robin.
Teaches you useful things like customer service and all this stuff. I agree. And how to work for money. But and then I was a gamer, like a lot of kids are, and I kind of was able to
Game of choice?
Actually, I don't really know. Like,
what year is this now?
Yeah, so this is early 2000s.
So but it's not World of Warcraft yet.
World of Warcraft wasn't quite there yet.
Okay.
But that's key to the story. So like it was in whatever was popular, Counter-Strike, Ultima Online was kind of like the imaginative thing. EverQuest was that day and era. But World of Warcraft was important because I was into games, but I also liked programming. I didn't really understand what that meant yet. And I found I could kind of take my sort of love for video games and this like figure out how to build these websites. And I was basically trying to build databases of content for the game. So it'd be like, you're finding items in a game, kind of look them up in the database. And World of Warcraft is kind of what, was coming out shortly after that and actually led to my like first real job post Burger King era, where we were effectively data mining their, the game files and building a big online database about it. And that company was called Curse, which is, I think, part of Twitch, which is part of Amazon. I don't know, the cascade.
I didn't realize all that stuff. But I do remember I was a WoW player, World of Warcraft WoW player. And
used to be Curse Gaming.
You would look up any item. Yep. And the SEO was Curse.
Yep. And it was like mods and everything else. It's like an interesting era because like there's some people that I know in San Francisco that I know from that era that were just like mod authors and stuff. So it was like a gateway drug almost for a lot of software. It's like self-taught software engineers. The thing I learned doing was basically MIRC scripts, which was their own little language in this chat room. And then I learned PHP quickly after that. So
very cool. Okay, PHP first. That's like a standard thing.
It was the best thing back in the day.
Were you MAMP stack or LAMP stack? MAMP.
Was that Mongo?
Macintosh. It was. So LAMP was the original thing.
I worked at Burger King. You think I could afford a Mac?
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, I got like my Macintosh when I went to college, and I remember I like heard about LAMP, and I was like, it was like Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. Yeah. And I was like, Linux. I really hope there's an easier way to do this. And then I found this like MAMP, somebody had packaged it up for Macintosh. I was like, yes, thank God. Okay, so PHP is your first language.
And I was on the LAMP, but I think I just had like a virtual server or something somewhere,
And then, okay, so you start doing PHP. When do you start dabbling in Python?
Shortly after that, actually. So I worked for this little tiny site for about a year doing World of Warcraft stuff. And then the Curse guys, who were all like 20 years old, mind you. None of us are like serious business professionals.
And you're in the Midwest, and where are they?
I'm in Nebraska. They are in Germany.
Right.
There's like basically French people that were living in Germany for some reason. I don't remember why.
I love it.
But Curse had already existed. So a year into this thing, they knew who I was. I was also just as aggro then as I am now.
Yeah.
Competitively, that is. And they're like, hey, why don't you come join us? And so I moved to Germany, worked on Curse for Actually, it wasn't that much longer, maybe 2 years.
And how old are you? Are you like 18?
So I think I moved to Germany when I was I moved before I was drinking age in America. I remember that much. And I think by the time I came back, I was drinking age.
Got it.
So I was probably I just turned 20, moved there, came back when I was 21. It was like super fun. And that's also like what introduced me to San Francisco because they moved the company here a year later and I came out here with them. It was just as expensive back then, mind you. We made a lot less money, but
it was not as expensive. Just for
it was not
it
absolutely.
Felt expensive.
It felt just as expensive.
Crazy. Yeah, I remember.
Actually, it feels cheaper now. To be honest with you,
in some sense,
even excluding my Sentry success, it feels a lot cheaper.
The matcha lattes are expensive, but like broadly, it doesn't feel that bad.
It's more affordable if you work in tech than it used to be.
Yeah, this is what I would say. Touch. No, just kidding. No. Okay, so and at Curse, Python or PHP?
That was Python. So that's when I picked up Django, and I was really involved in the Django community.
What's Django? Just describe something.
Django is, I think, still probably the largest Python web framework that exists. Yeah. Really, really good. It's not so modern anymore, but like I was big into that. Met a lot of. That's basically my entire career was Django. And actually, the reason I left Curse is because they wanted to switch to .NET, and I'm like, I don't want to do this. And I joined Dropbox because they were using Python. It was basically Dropbox or Instagram were the two choices for me. And I'm like, I'm gonna go somewhere where I know the thing, I'm good at it.
Yeah. But we've jumped around. We've gone out of order, if I recall correctly. So you're at
kind
Curse.
Of, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. This is an important stop. That
I worked at a bunch of startups, but it was like Curse. I went to a company called Discuss, which back in the day was like the little comment widget on basically every website.
It was DISQUS.
Yeah,
and
Discus.
Many people thought Discus. Yep. I also thought that.
Yeah.
And it was the best startup name ever because the first time you heard it called Discuss, you realized that was obviously the correct name. You were like, oh, obviously the comment widget is Discuss.
So what they would tell you is that's unintentional, and I think it's a lie.
That's got to be a lie.
It's got to be a lie.
I'll talk to Daniel.
Daniel swears. At least back in the day, he swore on it. Maybe he was fooling us all. But I worked for Discuss for 2.5, 3 years, something like that. Still Django, Python. It was fun. We were a small company.
What years are we at now?
That was 2008.
Got it.
To probably 2008 to maybe 2011ish.
Got it. And this is where you start to work on the open source project that would become.
Actually, Sentry existed right before that. I don't remember when. 2000.
Well, it wasn't Sentry before then, right?
Yeah, it was called Django DB log.
Exactly.
Random open source. Yeah. So I guess the history of Sentry is like random open source project I built. I built many random open source projects. Renamed it off of a StarCraft unit at some point because that's what we were naming things.
The gamer thread stays live.
Yeah, the gamer thread stays live.
I think a very fun, playful, delightful StarCraft unit. But the Sentry's like a very protective unit. It's like delightful, but very savage ultimately.
Yeah, actually I don't know why, because we always try to name things. We also had a few others. We had Nidus, which is like the Nidus one, which was our sort of distributed communication library for Redis that we made.
Makes sense.
We had something called Hive that I don't remember what it did. We had a few of these things. Mostly of the Discuss era, we started naming things this. So when I joined Discuss, they were using Django DB log. It was not good. Yeah. First couple weeks, I fixed it all.
What was the first feature and like what caused you to make Django DB log?
Somebody kind of asked me how you would do this. Like, hey, I have errors in my app, like my Django app. How would I like kind of log them into a database, show them on a dashboard? And I'm like, that seems, I don't know why you would do that. Let me here's an example of how I would do it. And I whipped up basically the MVP, which probably would achieve product market fit still to this day. That it was like a Django middleware, it captured the errors, put them on Django's admin kind of panel. And it had a lot of the context that we captured today. And I'm like, oh, this is kind of neat. And I just kept fiddling with it over the years and adding a little bit more from a feature point of view, more polish, all this stuff. And it's like one of those things, like I'm always the person who likes to hack on stuff. I want to have a project, even to this day. And so that was just one of my projects. And I'm like, I just want to keep tinkering with this. So.
And not to date you here, but I have to ask a funny question, which is, so now we think about like where do open source projects live? They live on GitHub. DjangoDB like is right around the same time as GitHub coming about. It might have predated GitHub.
It predated, I think. Because GitHub's first office was also below Discuss's first office.
Exactly.
And I think it predated it, but it was on, I think it started on Google Code.
It was on Google Code, and it was in IRC, and so people were talking about it, and the Django community starts to pick it up, and so it becomes open source, but pre-GitHub, which became like this great place to distribute open source.
Yeah. We moved to GitHub, I think, not actually super quickly, but fairly quickly in the grand scheme of history, you know?
They were Ruby people, so it was like.
That's true. They also loved dubstep, which was popular at the time. Let me tell you, like, we're one floor below them in this old building.
Sure.
Small building. There's like 10 of us on each floor. 5 o'clock every day, you just hear it. It's like that.
Wow. Big dubstep pick. Yeah. Top short. Okay, so now DjangoDB log, when does it become named Sentry?
I think it was like a year in after joining Discuss. I don't quite remember, but this is like when StarCraft 2 came out.
Yeah.
Which which is a super fun era in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Like San Francisco, this is peak San Francisco in my opinion. It's like all the companies are small. None of us make a lot of money, but the corporations have some money. So there's meetups, free pizza, free beer. There was Justin TV.
Yeah, well, because Justin TV and Twitch are just starting. So they start the what is Gaming After Dark. Another thing you mentioned that I just wanted to dig on is, so Chris is a designer and the founder of Sentry. I think one of the things Sentry's always been great at is this incredible design and creative sensibility. Obviously, a lot of that is you from an idea perspective, but Chris, a lot of the execution side. Why did you think this side project, open source project within Discuss, where you self-acclaimed only wanted to work on it when it was part of your job, needed a designer to work on it? Because I think that's way ahead of its time. Even now, I try and encourage open source projects. They should care about design, and people don't believe me. And this is, over 15 years ago.
I mean, I care about design. I'm not good at it by any means, but like it's something that's important to me, like visuals, aesthetic, like all these things. Like a lot of us do care about this. We just don't have the skills to make it good. And so whenever I have a project, the first thing I try to do is like socially pressure a designer to help me on it for free, ideally, because I can't afford to pay them. Even my side projects now, I'm like, how do I get somebody to help? And to be fair, it's a little easier these days and to do it, not pressure somebody to help me. But it's just something I cared about. And to be fair, it wasn't like cutting edge design. It wasn't time consuming design. It was like, oh, here's some colors that are like reasonable. Here's some round corners, Also harder back then, though, to be fair, to do any of that.
Super hard.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that Sentry is underway, you're at Discuss, you end up going to Dropbox. We can kind of fast forward through some of this. And then you decide at some point, like, I want to start a company around this open source project. And there's a few things in there that you should include about like how that's like kind of accidentally happened.
So we bootstrapped the company, and that was kind of this trigger of, we had a bunch of traction in the Django community. Basically, if you use Django, you use Sentry back in the day, right? And we had a lot of traction. And somebody kind of convinced me, they're like, hey, there's a guy that worked at Heroku he was a PM. And he's like, hey, you should launch an add-on out of this, because they're trying to make money off of add-ons. And I'm like, oh, that'd be cool. People can run it on Heroku. I can make a little bit of money. That seems great. That's not actually how it works, by the way. You had to build a SaaS service and then sell it via Heroku, it turns out. I got tricked a little bit. But I'm like, okay, maybe it'll make, we joked at the time like beer money. As in, like, there's not a lot of ambition. We're just like, it'd be great. It needs to pay for itself. Like, it doesn't have to pay for us, but like, we don't want to be spending money on a server bill every month, right? Yeah. And so that was actually like a requirement from day one. So it was not free. You had to pay for the cloud service. We had customers, right? It was actually profitable like that first day. But that was kind of what triggered the financial side to start the business out of it. And then we did that for, I don't know, what was it, like 2 or 3 years?
And to be clear, you're working jobs while doing
I'm working jobs, yeah. So I'm spending even more time nights and weekends and stuff. And, again, I'm like mid-20s or something. Yeah. And I think I started that at the tail end of Discuss, continued it in Dropbox. But eventually I get to Dropbox, and it's a pretty... They're going through their like hire everybody and their mother phase kind of, which is just, it's
that's how I got in the door.
Yeah, same. But it's kind of a miserable phase to live through of a company, because it's just like new faces every day. Yeah. You're spending so much time hiring people. I don't know. I'm not a good big company person either. Like, I just want to build stuff. I'm a great IC. I'm high throughput, but if people get in my way, I'm very low tolerance of it. Yeah. And so it was kind of this frustrating time period for me where I had Sentry that was super high demanding. I'm on call. It's like, it's an infrastructure project, right? It's tedious to manage. It's also bootstrapped, so I'm running like thin margins on the whole thing. And at the same time, I'm building Dropbox's it was like 1,000 server distributed test infrastructure, which I was almost exclusively managing and building. And so it was a lot of like too high stress, jobs per se, right? And I think it was like a year and a half. I'm like, okay, I got to do something about this. One of these has to go. And I'm like, what do I do? Blah, blah, blah. And VCs, as they do, always harass you, even if they're not interested. So like, hey, you should consider raising funds.
I love harassing people.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I'm like, yeah, Dropbox is like fine. Different era, mind you. This is still when we got paid okay, but probably 50% of what salaries are now, right? And so it's still, you're like, okay, well, it wasn't like I was giving up like $500,000 a year cash comp or something like that, right? And so I'm like, well, we got to a point where we had this bootstrap business. We could kind of pay ourselves. We couldn't quite match our salaries from Chris was at GitHub at the time. But we couldn't quite match our salaries, but we got really close. Like I ended up dropping my salary like $120K. I think I paid Chris a little bit more because he had a family, but that was pretty close. I was making like around 150 at Dropbox. And I'm like, equity, whatever, who cares? I've been in this startup game. It doesn't make any money. So I didn't really care about that, which in hindsight was fine. And so I'm like, okay, let's do it full time. Yeah. And so we made that decision, kind of kicked it off. And then from there, we're like, okay, what do we do? Do we go raise money? Do we keep riding the thin margins, it's stressful. Bootstrapping with thin margins, which is, I don't know why we chose this, but it is very stressful. So. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we always talked about in the beginning was, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit, So Sentry is this open source project that starts in the Django community. People use it in Django. I think from the moment we started talking about the company, you already had the sense that it made sense to also do, at a minimum, broad Python and JavaScript. You were always very adamant about that at a time when it was not so obvious. And now all of a sudden you're supporting multiple language environments and frameworks, and you're kind of like, there's a lot to be done here that makes sense, but we wouldn't be able to do very quickly if we just bootstrapped on these versions.
I think it's that, because like we were looking at this, and I think we could afford to hire 3 of our friends, basically. And so we hired Ben, Armin, and this guy named Matt.
You have much more impressive friends than I did at the time.
That's what happens when you're not like just out of college or whatever.
Yeah, Ben wrote a book on third-party JavaScript, and Armin is the creator of the Python framework Flask, just so that everyone knows.
Yeah.
which are like, these are useful friends.
Yeah, it was kind of one of those things where like, well, we can hire a few people, but then we're out of money.
Yeah.
And we're scary close to margins. And we had a bunch of competitors that were not bootstrapped. They had raised plenty of money.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I was fearful, but I was like competitive. Yeah. I'm like, I do not want to be beaten at any cost. And so I'm like, let's go raise money. Let's be more ambitious. I think we did it, honestly, like not knowing what we could do, because it's like, well, we got this little open source thing. Honestly, most people didn't take it seriously at the time. Like Dan, you were the first person that took it seriously, I think. Everybody else is like, this isn't a big business. There's nothing here. Or they're like, open source, that doesn't make any sense. How are you going to make money and all this stuff? And mind you, we had 2,000 customers, like $600K in revenue when we did this, right? Yeah. And so, anyways, we ended up raising money, and that kind of allowed us to, one, solve some more of the infrastructure problems. It allowed us to expand that sort of the language support. Yeah. And we were really big because like our entire thing was do what you want. Like that was kind of the premise of the company. And one of the things we wanted to do was like, for me particularly, is I wanted every single person I ever met to be using Sentry. Yeah. I wanted to have every conversation, if they're a peer of mine, be like, yeah, we use Sentry. That's basically true today, mind you, which is phenomenal. But that is a really, really different objective than most people starting businesses. It's not monetary driven. It's like, no, we just want to build a great tool that helps everybody. You got to make money doing it, of course, but
So when you started, my sense from what you've told, but you should correct me if I'm wrong, is you, first of all, we don't think about this as interesting now, but at the time you were using a bunch of open source technology yourself. Like you learned on PHP, you were presumably using Linux, Apache, maybe you started using Nginx or something at some point. And your databases, I suspect, were open source for all these things. You pick up Python and Django, which are all open source. And naturally you build these little tools. I'm curious, like, did you think at all at the time that Django DB was open source, that was a consequential decision at the very, very, very beginning? Or is it just like, why not? This is what everyone's doing.
Everything was why not. And I still kind of believe that. Yeah. Like I have a lot more thoughtful, informed opinions about how to do, like intentionality is what I have these days, right? But back then I'm like, I don't know, this is just what you do. Like you just build software, who cares if it's open source? Right. Like, why wouldn't it be? And it was permissive. Like we were BSD licensed, which is like crazy permissive, And I think it was always just one of these things. I had the luxury of working on it. Nobody cared. We were all like kids basically. And so nobody had like big company enterprise opinions about the scariness of open source. Yeah. And also it's like one of those things, it's interesting because once you go down the rabbit hole, like take Sentry. Even when we started commercializing, we had some closed source on the cloud service, right? Yeah. But the product was open source. And the rule was you had to use
billing software and stuff.
Yeah, it's like billing.
There's not some conspiracy here.
Yeah. But the rule was everything had to be open source. Like in the sense of we could not rely on anything proprietary. So even if there was a good solution in the industry to solve one of our infrastructure problems, was not allowed to be used. We had to make it adapt. Because otherwise you couldn't distribute. It's like all of a sudden nobody could use the software. And again, our goal, ignore open source. It wasn't like make more open source. It was like, we want everybody to use the software. And like, even back in the day, I don't know which version of the government shenanigans were going on at that point in time, but it's like, there's certainly sanctions against somebody or companies in poverty that can't afford anything. And so like you had companies all over the world using Sentry. Then now like Russia, like Yandex uses Sentry. Yeah. Actually, I don't care. Russia can't get me and we're fine. So I don't think that's confidential, but they've used it for ages. I've never met any of them. I just know they use it. Right?
And they use the open source Sentry.
They use the open source Sentry. Yeah. And now we're legally not allowed to sell them or anything. Right. And back in the day, even if we wanted to, it would have been too painful to do. And that's cool to me. That, politics aside, everything aside, it's cool to me that like tech can be neutral in a lot of ways. Like that we can just be like, yeah, you can use our tech. That's great. It's great that you get value out of that. We help other tech companies build better tech, ideally, right? Yeah. And it progresses like humanity forward. And to me, that's kind of like the reverse engineered, almost like I feel good about what I do thing. Yeah. I'm building like technology that helps us progress kind of as a society. So, but yeah, so that open source thing and everything else was always like, I just wanted more people to use my stuff. Yeah. It was like almost like attention seeking. I don't know how you describe it. And open source is a great way to increase distribution, right? And so it's just a natural thing. Even at Dropbox, like they let me work on, I basically open sourced everything I did at Dropbox. Yeah. And I don't think anybody really cared. They're probably just like, why?
Yeah, it seems like there might be some headaches. You
Fair
get some
question,
more tickets.
but it was I don't know. It's rewarding because you can share your work, talk about it. It's I don't know.
So initially, you do it. The company throughout its history, you're exactly right. We always were like, how do we everything should be open source because people should be able to run Sentry on their own. When did you start maybe getting more intentional about what open source meant to Sentry, do you think?
That's a good question. I think at some point we had talked like, okay, we should probably put it on a real license like Apache 2. And we're like, yeah, we don't really need to though.
Right.
And I think we only wanted that because you don't know what you don't know. And like, well, there's like some protections in and around patents and things like that. And those might matter. Right. We just didn't know. We have no patents. We don't even care. Yeah. But so there was like that. And we're like, yeah, it's not really worth changing the license. And then this actually wasn't even that long ago, 2018 maybe. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in that era, we became much more intentional. And it was just triggered by external forces, not venture capitalists like everybody conspiracy theorists think.
This is important because this is actually really important. One of my two most famous Hacker News comments ever that I'm very proud of, which is you guys made some license changes, which we're about to talk about, I think. Yeah. And somebody was like, it's because of the venture capitalists. And I, with my Hacker News account, was like, this is my moment. And I replied, I am the venture capitalist. They didn't even ask me about the change. And I probably would have lightly disagreed, but I'm fine with it because they run the company. But anyway, so
that's how it should be, to be fair.
Which I think is great. I think that's great.
I actually had a conversation with another founder about this. They're like, oh, we're worried our investors will not like if we go open source. I'm like, who cares?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what do they know? Like, in all fairness, like
they give you the money.
But yeah, so we had some like outside pressure from other companies trying to distribute basically commercialize our software. They're not part of, like, we almost exclusively build Sentry and have for the longest period of time. And we go out of our way to pay literally anybody we can that contributes to Sentry, contributes to a core project we use or something. That was the same then, same now.
And I just want to, I'm going to spend a little time on this because I want to talk about this at some point, but this seems like a natural time, but then we'll come back to this, which is, so I mean, Sentry's a little bit unique because there's lots of different types of open source projects. In terms of the distribution of how people engage with the project, who's committing and how that works.
The contribution model.
Yeah, exactly, contribution model. So, if you think about like Linux, right? Like Linus builds it, but there's a lot of companies that contribute to Linux now. Mm-hmm. There's core committers that work at a bunch of different places that have a vestige to Linux.
Plus a huge ecosystem of stuff that runs on it.
And a huge ecosystem that runs on Six. So it's quite distributed, the nature of Linux. But that's not quite the case for Sentry. I mean, as long as I can remember, first of all, the people at Sentry have committed the vast majority of the code. But you've also had people who are on the outside contributing things like SDKs or small patches. And you have always, as long as I've known, been like overly like kind of positively inclined towards those people. It's like, how can we compensate them? Can we have a consulting agreement? I remember there was like send them free shirts if they want to do meetups. And people always, there was a zeal for Sentry, but the percentage of commits or the amount of code was primarily done by people who worked at Sentry. Yeah. It wasn't open source in the sense of like, tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, it was not community built is how I describe it. Like there's some people that helped way back in the day, like contributed a little bit here and there. We had some customers contribute here and there. But it was mostly written by me in the early days. And I'm if you've ever seen me on a keyboard, I'm like insanely productive. Yeah. And so it was mostly that. SDKs, a lot of third parties, contractors, whatever. Some open source people who just wanted to contribute back. That was great, Well,
another thing you mentioned that I want to come back to set this up is, and you've never been somebody, and I don't think either of us have been somebody, we've never cared that people use open source Sentry and we're thrilled by that for the most part. So you mentioned the index rate. You think it's quite cool. I remember like early on, but like Uber was a huge user of the open source. And they would have a lot of like, requests and thought processes around that, which is great. But never once did you or I think, oh, we have to get Uber to pay us money.
Oh, I did try to get them to pay us.
At one point they did like some support contract.
Yeah, we actually charged him $5,000 an hour to have an engineer show up, and he wasn't allowed to touch a computer.
Right, they wanted like an insurance policy. It was very confusing. But we never said like.
But we couldn't get them to cloud was what was important, and we're like, it's okay. If you're not going to go to cloud, we're not going to force it. And there was a point in the early history where we're like, that's now the absolute truth. You want to self-host? That's great. Eventually, you're probably going to come to our cloud service if the product remains great, because it's a pain in the ass. It's infrastructure. You don't actually want to run it,
Well, and it's monitoring infrastructure. Like the moment it's the most valuable is when you least want to be worrying about the infrastructure of your monitoring tool, which is what you remembered hearing about to discuss, which is part of your experience. That's part of it. And then the other thing is, and I think we probably both agree this is not in a nefarious way, but the fact that Uber uses Sentry, even though it's open source, is much better for Sentry over long periods of time, the open source project and the company, than if they use a competitive product. And all these people who work at Uber who then think, I'm going to go start a new company or go work somebody else. I probably want to use Sentry.
That's the funnel.
And I don't really want to run this myself. I might as well use a very reasonably priced SaaS tool. So we never had any, because there was never any moment where we said, this really bothers us, or we can't believe these people are using Sentry for free. That was never any of the
we actually, because people are going to be people, early in the history of company, we've had to lay down the law that you are not allowed to sell open source accounts. Like if they are using self-hosted, that's their choice. You don't get to harass them. We had to lay that down and go to market. It's like that was off the table completely, right? But yeah, you pointed out like a really critical thing, and this is what I tell people about like open source, because like I have this article I wrote. My blog cra.mr, but open source is not a business model. It's distribution, all this other stuff. But that Uber story is like critical for people to understand, because Uber, they paid us a little bit, but not for cloud services. We couldn't convert and we gave up, right? And they opted. They wanted our help, right? They just wouldn't go to cloud, and we're like, well, we're not going to sell you anything. Everybody at Uber went to work for somewhere else. All those companies bought Sentry, bought Sentry Cloud Services. That's beautiful. Who cares about Uber? Like, it's great that they used it. We won, or like rather the business got the revenue it needed. You know, like we could justify that. And that's one important thing. The other important thing, and I have vivid memories of saying this because I was so frustrated with investors when we were raising the seed. I'm like, people be like, how are you gonna make money? Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I don't care if we don't make money. Nobody else will. That's it. It's a zero-sum game. If we don't succeed, nobody's going to succeed. We will burn the whole thing to the ground, you know? Like, we will make it so good and so cheap that nobody will have the opportunity to exist, you know? And then there's some intentionality there, to be fair. I could easily defend why open source was such a compelling strategy, but less so than when we eventually changed licenses and whatnot, of course. So
Okay, so now we come back to this moment where this external force comes in, who, and I'll say this part, but you won't have to. Their kind of view of this is open source is kind of for patsies almost, and like almost what's the most parasitic thing you could do. Like you could take a lot of work in open source, you could commercialize it better while having contributed nothing.
Do you want me to say the company?
No, I don't think we have to.
There's a company that likes to sell on-premise software. They sell a bunch of open source basically. Some is their own, some is other people's stuff. Their entire model is based on the belief that people are going to run things behind the firewall. Our entire model is cloud is the future, right? We know that there's a blend, obviously, but cloud services are every company's solution.
And if you want to run behind the firewall, you can use open source, which is wonderful.
And so they were trying to distribute Sentry, and they wanted to integrate it more closely, but like they didn't give back to the project. They didn't pay us anything. They didn't do anything valuable to anybody else other than they were trying to basically add commercial value to the thing they sold. And I don't care what the license says. To me, that's not okay.
Right.
And this is the fundamental argument in the open source ecosystem. It's like, it doesn't matter if the license says you can do something. That's fine. We made the choice of what the license says. But that also doesn't mean we have to be okay with that kind of behavior in the industry, right? And again, Sentry single source, we fund everything, right? You helped fund some of these things. And so we changed the license, and the license is basically a big middle finger to those kind of companies. It said, all the users, Yandex included, can all run it for free, no strings attached, same software we sell. Anybody that wants to commercialize it in any shape or form that looks like commercialization from a cloud service or like subscription services point of view, good luck. We have lawyers too. That was the day we went from open source to technically proprietary or source available, which we now call fair source. It's kind of our agenda behind this whole thing. And that was
which applies, by the way, importantly, things will eventually open source, but at the moment of release, they are not, which is a critical
good second. Let me talk about it. So we switched to the business source license, which TLDR, after it's variable, which is the complicated part about it. But after 4 years at most, I think we chose 3 years, the code becomes whatever other license you want. So we chose Apache 2. And you have sort of a restricted use clause. That was a little complicated. So last year, somewhere in the last 2 years, we built our own license called the functional source license, which was originally going to be the fully functional source license. So that like FFS, you can figure out what that acronym means. Mostly because we were tired of all these arguments, which got rid of all variability. It hard-coded everything. It said after 2 years, this has to convert to MIT or Apache. It has to be a permissive license, most importantly. And the only restriction is the cloud services restriction. And our intent was like, make it easy for legal teams, protect the people that want to run it and use it, make it so eventually it goes open source. It's like almost like the feel-good safety net in case the company fails. But also because then people there's trust, right? And that was kind of our solution. And we're still working on that. And then we wrapped all that up more recently in this sort of kind of initiative branding called Fair Source, which the idea with Fair Source is it encompasses a bunch of these values. And the overlap between open source and fair source, and I'm going to ignore free software, which is a completely different thing, but open source and fair source is fundamentally the freedom that we take away with fair source is the commercialization freedom. We don't believe everybody should be able to commercialize anybody's software no matter what. There's arguments on both sides of that, to be fair, but so it's like users can still use it. It's the real software. It's not open core. It's not like part of the software. It protects the business, and it's actually mandatory to convert. I think we actually made it mandatory to convert to a permissive license after a period of time, which is a big deal because permissive licenses have a lot more technical freedom, a lot fewer restrictions on use. So
all this happens, but one of the most important threads in all this is, at its core, at its roots, Sentry was an open source company. It was important to you. You were using open source technologies. We're huge fans of kind of open source at Sentry, even if from a technicality perspective, which we would acknowledge that's not technically the license we have today.
Yes, however, like so much of our stuff is actually
that's right.
built
That's
open source,
point.
permissive. Like we actually power every competitor in the industry with our open source tech. Like
right.
we distribute like symbolification and stuff like this. So
that's exactly
so you know it's all over the map what we do these days, but it's almost all some variant of open source or some of the values of open source.
That's right. But now you're doing a new thing. Tell us about the open source pledge.
Oh yeah. So the most recent thing is the pledge. So from a business point of view, I actually think it's important for everybody to understand, like there is ROI from a business, which is how we can justify these things. It's just marketing, right? And so I want people to understand that because like we actually have a business agenda with it, but it also is like a nice ethical thing.
Well, first, what is the open source pledge?
Yeah. And so, and this is, again, same with Fair Source. We have this agenda like to better the open source ecosystem, right? Especially because we think there's a lot of these decisions we made that pair really closely together, right? Like our approach to market share works really well because of the distribution of open source or open source like licenses. That also allows us to give back, whether it was through contractors or us funding random projects, because we often do these with no strings attached. To now us in the last few years, just straight up donating to our dependency tree. Like in the past, we donate to like Django Software Foundation, all this stuff. Now we literally directly donate to people that write libraries.
Yep. And
some of those people can start businesses that are really successful, but then there's a lot of them that can't. And there's obviously like a sustainability conversation in the industry of like, NPM is the famous target where there's infinite dependencies. Nobody knows what they do. There's a lot of security concerns. They're not maintained, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we're inspired. Actually, when we hired Milan, our CEO, many years ago, at some point, because he came from VMware, bigger company stuff, he turned me on to like the pledge 1%. We had talked about like, maybe there's a way we can do that with sort of our ideals in mind, the open source thing. We're like, okay, what if we could do like the 1% pledge for open source? Yeah. And that kind of kicked us off early on. Like, we're like, what if we pledge like 1% of revenue and like something like that? And then could we get others? And they're like, but then they got to share how much revenue they make. And they're probably not going to do that. We played around with a lot of ideas, right? But our goal was like, can we give more money to maintainers? And this is the business ROI, is like, it's marketing. You actually get brand recognition from it. And brand awareness is the greatest thing you can have in a business like ours. Like we like to talk about liquid death in companies like this. They're one of the greatest,
talking about liquid death.
One of the greatest brand marketing companies of like the last decade.
Yeah.
Like they're just selling like basically water in a can.
Yeah.
There's nothing more to it than anybody else, but they're great at it.
Yeah.
And they just do stupid marketing, right? Yeah. So brand marketing, I very much believe in, and us doing a good thing with open source is just brand marketing from the business ROI. It's actually not that much money in the grand scheme of marketing budgets. And we're like, what if we could take that, turn it into a program, social pressure. I'm not going to use the word bully yet, but social pressure other companies into also doing this because it's good and it kind of needs to happen. And they actually get like a lot of benefits out of it. You know, they actually potentially de-risk a lot of things and they get the marketing benefit, right? And so open source pledge, which I think formally launches sometime early October, is kind of our attempt to like productionize a version of the program we were running internally that we thought was pretty successful, which the TLDR is like for every full-time engineer on staff, you have to give at least $2,000 a year to your dependency tree.
Which for, just to be clear, for engineers that are based in like the Bay Area is a relatively small percentage of their compensation.
Here,
Now, it changes based on where the engineers are based. So in different places it's complicated, but in the US, it's a relatively small percentage of what you spend. I still remember when I came out to the Bay Area in 2009, there was a period of time, like maybe in like 11 or 12, you remember this, where I remember it around Asana and Quora. They like would, when they were recruiting people, the recruiting websites would talk about the benefits you would get joining the company. Yeah. And I think it was like $10,000 for the setup of your choice. Like you get a fancy chair and 2 fancy monitors and a standing desk. You had $10,000 to spend however you wanted. It was a recruiting. And this, to be clear, that would cover 5 years.
For one developer.
For one developer. And we've had a lot of inflation in developer salaries since.
Yep. And the great thing is, and there's a lot of challenges with it, right? Like if your company's in another country, that's a lot of money. But it actually doesn't matter. Our goal is to not say, can we get every company to do it? Our goal is to get every U.S. technology company of any significant scale, like Series B is a great target area, to join this thing. Because if we could even get $100 million, which in the grand scheme of all these companies, that's actually not that many companies, that would change a lot of people's lives. Yeah. And that could like make more full-time people that just work on useful open source. Like what I did in my career was always just build useful stuff. Yeah. Like I built a lot of open source libraries, no strings attached, some of them for the businesses I was working at, some not. I didn't get paid anything for that. And what that means, I'm not saying I should have, but what that meant is there was not really a recognition or incentive for me to keep doing it, let alone to maintain all those, which I did not maintain all of those. And that's okay. But we're like, we could change that. And so that's kind of like the agenda behind it. We actually talked at one point, the original inspiration for this, of the $2,000 thing was like, what if we could do an employee perk where we let every employee do that? Right. Well, one, they're not going to do it, which is a problem. 2, there's no vendor that makes that reasonably easy for us to do as a perk. You have that for like charitable matching and stuff, which is great. But I'm like, come on, GitHub, come on, please help us out. And then OpenAI came and now nobody cares again. But and so we're just like, it'd be cool if we could get a bunch of people on. We've done okay so far. We got a bunch of startups. We're still working on it. But I'm like, if this is the last thing we kind of do at Sentry, that's like a really big hurrah. That's also cool because it's like we're finally at a stage of company where we actually have a lot of influence and power. People understand we exist. We're big. And we're like, we can do some cool things now. We can actually like be very, very helpful to people beyond just giving them our software for cheap or free or whatever, So,
well, I think obviously I'm a biased fan of Sentry, but to give you guys credit for this, like a lot of people would point out the challenge of sustainable open source and like we need to do something to change the funding model for open source. A lot of people have pointed this out, and there's some wonderful startups that have done things around that I think enable Sentry amongst others to give directly to maintainers in certain ways, although at relatively small volumes today, but they're doing their best. But very few people actually like put their money where their mouth is.
That's
actually do it. By the way, there's some companies like big companies like the Googles and Facebooks of the world with their own open source efforts, whether it's Kubernetes or Google on Linux or Facebook with React, or PyTorch or Llama, they put in a lot of work. But for a lot of companies, it's non-trivial. You don't have an open source product of your own to be investing in, but you fully rely on open source. You're almost everyone I know is running Linux servers for any company. Your programming languages, which we take for granted that programming languages are open source, but they have not always been that way. And still in the finance industry, you can find them. They're not. Databases. And so where Sentry's been fortunate enough to build a business model that can kind of coexist nicely. It's harder for other companies. But one way they can do it is something simple like this, where for every engineer, at least $2,000 a year, you do open source. It's still a fraction of the cost of that engineer for the year.
It's literally a rounding.
And it's the investment you would want to make in tools you're using anyways. Like you want them to be more sustainable. And I always think to myself when I think about the pledge, I hope one of the things that happens is people say, this is a really important piece of software that we use. There's not even an obvious person to give the money to. That's alarming. And I think that's like a non-trivial circumstance in open source sometimes where you rely on some package, but the maintainer is not even working on it anymore or is incentivized to focus on fixing bugs. And you finally think for the first time, like there was no need to give the money to for a thing we deemed was so important.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, and actually you touched on something that I think is super relevant here because one challenge we've had with this whole thing is a lot of people do give in great ways to open source already, like Facebook or Meta as an example, but it hasn't solved the problem. And so this is actually super important because we keep going back and forth internally on this. So like Meta has done phenomenal stuff. You can't say Llama, by the way. It's like illegal to call it open source. You get it's not good. But they've done phenomenal stuff for open source.
The alpaca cousin thing.
Yeah, but React
Vicuña. I've learned all the cousins of the llama.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's fun. I think it's a guanaca. Anyways,
like React is one of the most useful technologies we've had from a broad open source in recent history. Those problems are not problems. Like great funding, great maintainability, Linux Foundation, ludicrous amounts of money that they rake in, right? Those are not problems we're trying to solve. The problem is, and so those are great, we want to recognize companies that do that. Those don't qualify for the pledge. And that's really important because what we're trying to solve is not those problems because they're already actually in a good spot. And again, we don't want to take away from that. But the pledge is very much like, you have a lot of these dependencies from this random person that maintains a bunch of stuff because they like it, they're passionate about it. You could reward them. You could tip them. You'd be like, buy them coffee kind of thing. That's how I think about it personally. I'm like, this is a tip jar. Make people feel like some recognition for the amount of personal time they put on all these random things that like power our silly websites and stuff. Because there's so much of it that's unfunded and is never going to be remotely big enough that could be funded by any big company or a VC. And then a lot of it's like, it's trivial to rewrite, but like we're not rewriting, we're still relying on it. And so that's our main goal is really to focus on the people that have no other support mechanism in this whole thing.
You said tip jar, but I just want to point out, you should, this is an idea you can steal from me for this project. You should create an animation that's like the square register turning around with the tip screen. That's like that moment where you're like, wait, what? When do we start tipping for coffee?
We should do when you get Stripe on board and like,
flips around,
you know how like everything you buy these days, there's like, how do I not tip because I'm not supposed to tip here, but somehow you like are guilt tripped into tipping these things.
See,
it's just like, in the checkout, there's like how much you want to tip to open source. We actually have. There's been people talking about like an open source.
Yeah, because Carbon Emissions does a version of this.
Yeah,
right? Yeah, that's right. And Stripe enables it. I think we could talk to Patrick.
Yeah, it's like that would be a clever way to inject this.
There you go.
It's like a checkbox, you enable it, and
just get to open source. Okay, so I have one more question before I let you go. But while I have you, so we're doing this whole open source thing. You're one of the foremost open source creators and company founders of the generation, which is kind of an incredible thing. But I hope you appreciate that and take stock of it. But I have to ask because I'm sure people want to know. What do you think the next 10 years of open source looks like? And I know it's a hard question and I didn't prep you on it.
Yeah.
So you're off the cuff. But what are some big thoughts you have about open source for the next decade?
I don't know. I think it's complicated because everything always has to adapt.
Yeah.
Like failure is always rooted in stubbornness, in my opinion. Like, you need to be stubborn. You need to have conviction in your decisions, but there's always a lot of noise in the industry that you got to see past. And the reason we're doing what we do is because we think there are serious problems that are not going to magically solve themselves, right? Licensing is one of the particular modern challenges that everybody's talking about, right? I think it's going to continue to evolve. I think in the best case, a lot of like open source stays roughly what it's always been. There's more and more of it, but there's a lot more things controlled by big companies these days. Like there's it's a very different era than when kind of we grew up in the industry. The ML thing's weird and wild. I don't know what's going to happen there. I don't even know if it ends up being related to open source, because I'm like, it's cool. You got some open models or whatever they're going to end up calling them. They're still working on the terms here. I'm like, what's that do for me? Like, I don't have a million GPUs. Yeah. So I actually don't know. I think a lot of what we have will keep looking the same. I think there are some very serious problems with like things like the NPM ecosystem that I don't know if they're solvable problems. I think the best way to solve problems, this is my career lesson as an engineer, is always change the constraints. Yeah. Like, change the problem you have to solve. And if you told me the problem with NPM is there's 99% of packages are unmaintained and have a risk of security, I'm like, well, then you should have 99% less packages or something like that, right?
There should be like, there's like a time-based detonation on a package. Like, nobody touches this for a long time.
So like the argument in other programming languages, like standard library is more of a thing. And so that to me is probably the most serious concern of these days, because there's pros and cons of both models, right? But it's like fundamentally if you ignore the ML world, which has a lot of open source stuff going on in it, and I don't know anything about it. But I'm basically an expert on RAG now. So,
sure. But
I do think this sort of the ecosystem of third-party software we rely on is like exploded. I don't know. I would love to see, it's probably hard to measure, but if you saw like a chart, even of our own, of like, it used to be like a little bit of third-party software and then Postgres and some stuff now, and it's like we have 10,000 different vendors, And that's probably true. I bet we have 10,000 different vendors at Sentry if you treat every single individual author of open source as a vendor of code we rely on, right? And that's insane to think about,
Yeah, it's a lot.
And so, that's you can't fix that problem.
Well, at a high level, it's like a good thing that that's possible, but at some level, you need to figure out how to grapple with the new world you've wrought, right?
Here's a prediction. I bet somebody will find a way to monetize if JavaScript doesn't change, because JavaScript is one of the most important ecosystems. If JavaScript doesn't change, I think somebody will find a way to monetize almost like a curated third-party standard library or something like that, to where like you've got all the utilities baked in for the most part of all these common concerns. You don't have to plug and play a bunch of different vendors, right? Because that is one of the biggest issues of that ecosystem, and it's a real challenge these days. And so,
for sure, David, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure I'll see you around soon.
Yeah, this was fun.